So I had this plan because I thought this week might be just a little overwhelming for me. And it was more overwhelming than I even anticipated. I have been so deeply touched by the gracious and appreciative and supportive and tearful moments that I have experienced since news of my resignation went out. And then to add to the week, my son decided to create a little chaos by choosing to make an impromptu trip home so that he could work his Fenway Park job for the first 2 games of the World Series. Matt's in California at school, so it was a bit of a trip. And then my brothers are arriving this evening because we need to move my mom into a nursing home unit. So it has been a week. So I've been working on this plan that what I was going to do was go back into my sermon files and choose one of the sermons that I had preached on stewardship more than a decade ago. I was going to defy Barbara Buzzino. Barbara Buzzino was a long-term member of this church, Debbie Blanchard's mother, Cass and Sal's too. She was very outspoken in her opinions, including saying to ministers that they dare not even consider repeating even part of a sermon. But I thought maybe, just maybe, I could get away with it this time. But then the Stewardship Committee very carefully decided to plan out the sermon series, and they chose that this particular Sunday, the focus would be on thanking God for changes in our own lives, in our personal lives, changes for the good. And then the next couple of sermons will be on change for good in the world and in the church. So I couldn't defy Barbara Buzzino. It forced me to think about creating a new sermon, and it also encouraged me to take a few moments in the sermon to share with you some of what's been going on with me and the changes that are on the horizon. So this morning, we focus on the many ways that God moves into our lives, touches our lives, and brings about change within us, change in our own lives, changes that are good. And so we're first going to hear a Bible story about a time when God brought about change that was immediate, abrupt, and sudden.
Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, that he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." Now the men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice, but they saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias?" He answered, "Here I am, Lord." And the Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying, and he has seen a vision, a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight." But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here to your saints, and he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who invoke your name." But the Lord said to him, "For he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before the Gentiles and kings, and before the people of Israel. I myself will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias went and entered the house. He laid his hands on Saul and said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." Immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. Then he got up and he was baptized. And after taking some food, he regained his strength. For several days he was with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." And all who heard him were amazed and said, Is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem among those who invoked his name? And has he not come here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief of priests?" Saul became increasingly more powerful and confounded by the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Messiah.
So that is the story of the conversion of the Apostle Paul. He was a very faithful Jewish man, and he had been persecuting members of this newly forming group, religious group that would eventually be called Christians. And then one day he was literally knocked off his feet, his sight was taken away, and God changed him. And no longer was Paul persecuting those who were members of this newly forming religious group. Instead, Paul became a believer. And he became such a strong believer that he went around his world encouraging other people to believe as well. God caused a change in Paul, a change for good, and it was in an instant moment. Now, in 2012, Merriam-Webster added the phrase aha moment to the dictionary, and they defined it as a sudden realization, insight, recognition, or comprehension. And so we can see here in Paul that he had an aha moment, one of those moments of great inspiration. And that's sometimes how God moves in our lives. It's with an aha moment that we're going through life, and then all of a sudden it's like we get knocked and we change for good. Jay Leno wrote an article recently in which he described an aha moment in his own life. He was just 8 years old. He was living in a suburb outside of New York City, going to school, and he was hanging out with a group of guys that were a little bit older than he was, about 11 or 12 years old. They weren't particularly bad, but they weren't a group of angels either. And so Leno described that one day they were on the playground just hanging out, and then one of the boys pulled out a picture that was supposedly pornographic. Although Leno said if you looked at it, it was so blurry, you really had no idea what it actually was of. Now, Leno says he was no angel. He was a prankster. He didn't like school, so he didn't do very well. But something happened in that moment as he watched this group of guys all crowding together, standing on tiptoe, bunched together, trying to take a look at this picture. And he noticed one of the boys had a small knife in his hand and was just playing with it. And so he just stepped back. And he kept watching the boys, trying to get this look and that knife, and he walked away. Because he said he could see the path that this group of boys was on and the road where it might lead them, and he didn't want to be part of that. And he said that every decision, every moral decision he made after that particular experience was based on walking away that day. So that when he was older and he was at a party and people were drinking and they said, "Let's go drive," he would say no. Or as a talk show host and as a comedian, there were a number of times when he could have chosen very harsh and critical and mean-spirited comedy, but he chose a different path. Now, Leno himself can't really describe what happened in that aha moment, what made that change. He doesn't talk about it as if being clear about what caused that to change his heart. Sometimes he talks about it in terms of his mom, who always encouraged him to think through the consequences of his decision. But as people of faith, we just might see in there the Spirit of God, God working and creating an aha moment so that Lino could make a choice and a change for good. An aha moment, a sacred one at that. Now, my Uncle Harold was my dad's older brother by 2 years. My father, when he would describe his call to ministry, it was really like an aha moment, and he attributed it to being connected to his brother. So my Uncle Hal was a student at Bucknell University, and my dad was working at a local or a nearby Baptist camp, also in Pennsylvania, called Camp Corbley. It was the beginning of the Second World War, and my Uncle Hal got drafted into the service. But before he left for base camp, he went to see his little brother to say goodbye. So they spent the day together at camp, and then at the end of the day, they walked up this trail to the road, and a bus came, and my Uncle Hal boarded it and went off. My dad said he just watched that bus until it disappeared over the horizon. And then he walked back into the woods because tears were streaming down his cheek. He didn't want to get right back into camp. He sat on a bridge where there was a small stream, realizing that he might not ever see this brother he so idolized ever again. And he said that in that moment, he felt the call from God to help people live life and to live it as abundantly as they possibly could. That in that moment, he felt God's call to ministry, to be in the church with people, to help them live life fully and abundantly. An aha moment, because with determination, my father followed that call for the rest of his life. An aha moment, a sacred one at that. For me, I don't count a lot of aha moments in my life, and I'm actually pretty jealous of people who feel as if they just knew in one moment exactly what they were supposed to do. My life more resembles some different biblical characters. Jonah, for example.
Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, "Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid his fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord.
So, God asked Jonah, can you go please say a word to the people of Nineveh? And Jonah goes in the opposite direction. There's the prophet Jeremiah. When God said, would you please be my prophet? And Jeremiah said, I can't possibly do that. I'm way too young. And then God asked Moses, please lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. And Moses said, well, I can't really speak all that well, so I don't think I should do that. I often image God as a spirit, but when I hear these kind of scriptures, I kind of see God with hands over the face saying, what in the world do I have to do to get to these people? That's more descriptive of my life, that God has been patiently, faithfully, and persistently urging and encouraging and inviting me to consider change. This past week, I was thinking a lot about how I think God in great wisdom knows to start working on me kind of early, so when the time is actually right, I'm actually ready to make that change, the change for good. Because God works constantly, persistently, patiently, and faithfully with me, because my call to ministry could not be more different than my dad's. Walking down memory lane this past week, I decided to pull out my ordination paper. That's a paper that you write when you're pursuing ministry. John DiNardo back there, who just went through this, knows this paper well. But in it, you're supposed to explain your theology, your understanding of God, of the world, of the church, and your own spiritual journey and your call to ministry. And so as I was reading that, I was reminded of how very much I tried to avoid that call to ministry. Part of it was because I had a father and grandfathers who were ministers, and so I was pretty familiar with what the life of a minister was like, and the amount of time you spend. And I grew up in Colorado. I could never ski on Sundays because you had to be in church, and I'm like, do I really want to do this? And then I was avoiding it because I never wanted to be a public speaker, and that was kind of a drawback from being in ministry. I wasn't sure that was anything that I really ever wanted to do. And so even when I entered into Harvard Divinity School, I wasn't going to go into the ministry. I was going to get a PhD in biblical studies so that I could teach and not be a minister. And yet while I was there, I started to study ministry, and I started to work in a faith-based community organization. I worked in a church. And I began to accept this call to ministry that I had been so running away from, that I had so been avoiding. And in 1985, I was at an ordination council. There was one vote against me because I was a woman, but I was voted into ministry, and I began my work. And I worked for 5 years at Valley Forge, the headquarters for our denomination, and since then I've been here with you. And it has been a wonderful time to be here in ministry. This church is incredible with all of the gifts and the resources and all the work that we can do together. And throughout my time here, every couple of years, God and I have a conversation. Is this where I'm still meant to be? Do my gifts and skills match what the church needs? Do I still have the enthusiasm and the energy to do the work here? And for so many years, the answer was absolutely yes. But then over the last little bit of time, I felt God sort of persistently niggling at me, suggesting that maybe before I retire, it's time to think about another call to ministry, another way to use my gifts. And I argued, because I love this church, what it stands for, what you do together, and the connection I feel with the people. But God is persistent and faithful and has called me and all of us to make a change. And I do believe it is an exciting change, it is a painful change, and it will be a change that is good. So sometimes God brings about change in our lives with these aha, sudden moments, and sometimes it's because God is just faithful and persistent and will work with us to embrace change that is good. God will reach out to us in the ways that we most need it, because God knows us best and knows how to relate to us. And God will reach out and bring about change in us in moments of joy and in moments of despair. Last week, Dwayne Anderson talked about a sermon that I preached soon after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And that was a time in which I think God brought about change out of despair. These are the two scriptures that were read in that sermon.
Reading from Proverbs. My child, if you accept my words and treasure up my commandments within you, making your ear attentive and inclining your heart to understanding, if you indeed cry out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for a hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God, for the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. And then this reading from the book of Revelation, chapter 7. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these robed in white, and where have they come from?" And I said to him, 'Sir, you are the one that knows.' Then he said to me, 'These are they who have come out of a great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple. And the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them. They will hunger no more and thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of the water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes."
So the title of that sermon was, "Does God Have Enough Hands?" And in it I shared the story of Bill Geist, who is a news correspondent. He lived in New Jersey in a small town near New York City. It was a place that many people who worked in New York City lived, and so the town was grieving because a number of their citizens had died in the terrorist attacks. And Bill Geist shared this specific story of one of his friends. She was a mom, had 3 little girls. And she was talking with Bill about how difficult it was to explain to her daughters what had happened, especially to her 5-year-old daughter, Molly. And the mom said that at the end of her conversation, she looked at Molly and said, "You know, I really do believe that God reached into that rubble and pulled your daddy up to heaven." And Molly said, "But Mom, does God have enough hands? Does God have enough hands for everyone?" And in that sermon, I said to Molly and to all of us that yes, I believe God had enough hands to reach into that rubble and to bring into the heavenly realm, into a loving, divine embrace, every life that was lost so tragically on that day. And I went further to say that God has enough hands because we can be God's hands. We can be God's hands of comfort, and we can be God's hands of a reasonable and just response. Because do you remember what happened? Immediately, there were so many who responded with violence and distrust of anybody associated with the Muslim community. And I believe there was a change in me and a change in this church in response to that. That sure, I had believed in religious tolerance. I'd been to a Jewish and Buddhist temple. I'd visited a mosque. But it was a change because now I needed to stand up and to really live and preach and support religious tolerance and justice. And think about what we as a congregation have done since then. All of the times we've had speakers, the interfaith organizations that we've supported. Think about the studies that we have done together to open ourselves up and to accept and be more supportive of religious tolerance of all those who believe. Now, I want to be clear that I do not believe that God causes tragedy. I think God wills good things for all people. But when there is tragedy, I do believe that God can move in our lives and change us for good. And can you believe it? We need to continue that today. Just think about what happened yesterday. Preaching, teaching, living, acceptance of those who worship differently than we do. Boy, is that critical now more than ever. So God moves in our personal lives. Individual lives can change us with those aha, sudden moments, or will patiently, faithfully walk with us. And even in the midst of tragedy, God can move in our lives and bring about change that is just so very good. Amen.